So David, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be hosting you at MSR today as part of our Distinguished AI Lecture series. And I know you'll talk a little bit later about some of your work on causal modeling. But what I want to do is take a step back and think about how you got to where you are today. So right now you're a professor of statistics, computer science, and in the Data Science Institute at Columbia, and are clearly somebody who's very, very well known in the area of probabilistic topic modeling and Bayesian machine learning. And so I want to understand how you got there. You were an undergraduate at Brown, is that right? In mathematics. What caused you to go to Brown to study mathematics?
I was an undergrad at Brown. I loved Brown. And I studied math and CS. It was a double major. And also, first of all, thanks for having me here. MSR has been a special place to me for many years. I was here as a grad student. So at Brown, I majored in CS and math. And I had a professor there, Leslie Kaelbling, who she's since moved to MIT, but she was at Brown back then. And she got me interested in AI research. She taught a great class about AI and then invited me to join her research lab. And I wrote a senior thesis with her. And so she kind of, sparked my interest.
Okay, that's great. She was also Michael Littman's.
Yeah, he was my TA. He was a graduate student back when I was at Brown.
I knew Michael when he was at Bell Labs and at Melcor. So from there you went to Berkeley to work with Mike Jordan. Again, how did you pick him from the many options you probably had at the time? And did you have any idea of what you were going to focus on?
I didn't. So what happened was after college, I moved to the Bay Area, and I got a job at SRI Research. And I was writing Lisp code, just writing big software packages in Lisp, which I'm not sure we should be doing, but but it was really fun. And
what was the application area?
Planning. Yeah. So Karen Myers and was my boss, and it was great. And at some point, Leslie emailed me and said, "Hey, you should think about going to grad school." And so I applied to a bunch of grad schools, and I wanted to stay in the Bay Area. And she said, "You should look up Mike Jordan. He's a good advisor." And this was a different time where I could just email Mike Jordan, in 1999, and say, "Hey, I'm a prospective PhD student. Can we meet?" And he said, "Sure." And so he sent me a paper about variational inference, which has turned out to be something I worked on a lot. And we met for 15 minutes, and that was it. And so I wanted to stay in the Bay Area, and I loved Berkeley from the minute I saw it. So I went
What's
there.
interesting about that is really how many personal ties are involved. So Leslie reached out to you.
Yeah, she did.
And recommended Mike. So I had no idea about whether you had gone to Berkeley explicitly to work with him, or it seems like a somewhat more less well planned thing. And it's interesting. In my career, I've also found that I make these real life decisions based on an opportunity that arises. And so it's interesting to hear that you've had some of those same things.
Yeah, no, it wasn't a big design.
Okay.
Both my parents went to Berkeley.
Okay.
And they were in graduate school there, so yeah.
But so you've had, as I said at the beginning, an amazing influence in statistics, in computer science, and in a variety of different application areas, from language modeling to some recent applications in medical records and understanding those. This is evidenced by your citations, which I think are on the order of 70,000 citations over a little bit more than 15 years. One paper really stands out in that amazing publication record, and it's your paper from 2004 with Andrew Ng and Mike Jordan on latent Dirichlet allocation. That paper has been cited, I just looked it up last night, 27,000 times. So
that's a lot.
1,700 times a year, about almost 7 times per working day. So this paper has had a tremendous influence, and I know that in it you certainly referenced some of the early work that I had done on latent semantic indexing, some of the work that Thomas Hoffman had done on probabilistic latent semantic indexing or aspect models. And my recollection is that you really changed that in a couple of fundamental ways. You first put it on really strong theoretical foundations and had generative models, but also made sure that documents and words were interchangeable in the representations. And so can you talk a little bit about how you came up with that formulation, how you decided to look at some of the language modeling aspects?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's an honor to talk about it with you since
Yeah.
it builds on your seminal work on latent semantic analysis. And
That wasn't generative.
What's that?
That wasn't generative or probabilistic.
But that was the story. So so I went to Berkeley, and it was like I think it was the summer of 2000 or maybe 1999. I went on to a research internship at NEC Research. Was it NEC Research? Yeah, NEC Research. I don't know if it's around anymore. It was in Boston.
Oh, in Boston, okay.
I might be getting the company wrong.
Okay.
But I definitely went to a research lab in Boston. And I worked with Pedro Moreno. That I know.
Yeah.
It might have been DEC Research. I
That-
think it's no longer there.
Okay.
But anyway, so I worked with Pedro Moreno, and he is in speech recognition, and he had this big data set of radio transcripts. They took radio shows and they put them through a speech recognizer, and they had noisy transcripts, and he wanted to segment them automatically. And to make a long story short, we used a variant of the aspect model of Thomas Hoffman's method for finding topics in what he called aspects in text to segment these noisy transcripts automatically. Then I went back after the summer, and my office mate was Andrew Ng. And Andrew Ng said, let's have coffee. And I said, sure. So Andrew Ng and I went to Brewed Awakening, which is a coffee shop next to the CS department in Berkeley. And he said, what did you work on over the summer? And I said, well, I worked on something related to the aspect model. And he said, something's always bothered me about the aspect model. And I'm not joking. He took out a napkin and he drew on the napkin the simplex of how documents exhibit topics, the document topic simplex, and pointed out that the aspect model sets up a parameter for each document of how it exhibits each topic, and that as the data set grows, these are parameters that grow with the data, and that's usually a bad idea from a statistical perspective. It leads to overfitting and things like that, which of course happen in the aspect model. So to be clear, right in the history, the seminal work was yours to sort of factorize the matrix of documents by words, right? This was the act of inspiration. Thomas Hoffman then put it into a probabilistic framework, and really Christos Papadimitriou did too.
Yes,
if you look at that, if you look at his work, they put it into a probabilistic framework that said, hey, let's think about this factorization in terms of documents generating words. And in Thomas Hoffman's, there were topics and there were documents, and each document was associated with a parameter, how much it exhibited each topic. And then what Andrew Ng pointed out to me in Brewed Awakening was that it's a bad statistical idea to do that. Let's instead put a prior over the topic proportions, a Dirichlet prior, and let's see if we can fit that model. That made the whole thing fully generative, right? Once you put a prior on the topic proportions, if you hold the topics fixed, then you can now generate new documents using the model. That's the difference between LSA, PLSA, and LDA. And that was really where LDA started that day. Then,
how long did it take to get from that insight to the early paper?
A lot of years. I think maybe 1 year or 2 years.
It was a NeurIPS paper, wasn't it? First.
Yeah, so first it was a NeurIPS paper. And there's a story within a story there, which is that, so then I said, sure, let's, this sounds fun, let's work on it. I was a second-year graduate student. And that's when I started learning about variational inference. So that's another part of this picture is that so here's this model, and it's hard to calculate the distributions that you need to use it. And so I started learning about variational inference, which was this method that Mike and his students in the late 90s had started to work on as a way to fit difficult to calculate probability distributions, as a way to approximate difficult to calculate probability distributions. And so it was through working on LDA that I learned about variational inference, and then it was through working on LDA that we learned how to scale up variational inference. The whole thing took about 2 years, and I really liked it. One aspect of this that I really liked was this was in 2000, I guess, that we were working on it. The NeurIPS paper was from 2001. And I had a laptop, and I could store text data on my hard drive.
Right.
And I just felt a jolt of excitement to be able to kind of carry my laptop, have data on my laptop that I could analyze. And I mean, I remember seeing the topics emerge from those early analyses, and it was exciting. It was magical to me. Maybe I was naive. I was a student, and it was silly to feel magical about those kinds of things. And now, of course, we know what was going on. But there was an element of just raw enthusiasm to why I liked working on it.
So at that time, if I recall correctly, the sorts of data sets you were looking at were things like some of the Trek Newswire data and maybe others. And those were on the order of 20, 30,000 short articles.
Yeah, that's right.
And
less, really, 20,000 was big. 5,000 is what we started with. Yeah.
And what? How many topics? Hidden variables? Hundreds?
Yeah, maybe 100. But when we started,
so what did that take? How long did it take for you to start? With that amount of data, seeing results.
So days. Right. So
So you weren't exactly watching the results come out in real time.
I did have the EM algorithm email me every time it completed an iteration, and I enjoyed that because in the morning I woke up and my inbox was filled with EM iterations, or more usually my inbox was filled partway to EM iterations and then it stopped because there was a bug. Yeah. But yeah, no, we parallelized it, and it was a big effort to analyze just 5,000 documents. Now, the way that we scaled it up back then, there really were some of the innovations were from the computational side, but a big innovation was algorithmic, where at some point, I was scrutinizing the variational updates, the updates to the algorithm, and saw that there was a clear way to make it faster mathematically. That let us scale from 5,000 to things like 20,000 and 50,000. Scaling it to then 100,000 and 1 million, that happened later on, maybe 10 years later, with stochastic optimization.
And so what was the algorithmic insight that allowed you to?
It was that a gradient that I was zeroing out by taking gradient steps could be zeroed out analytically.
I see.
Yeah. So it's part of a more general story about exponential families and variational inference that was then told in the subsequent years.
Okay. Yeah. It's a really fun story to hear. Talking about the size of the data sets and the compute power that we had 15 years ago versus now. If you look at over the last 5 to 10 years, the field of machine learning has been really transformed by a lot of the deep learning efforts, starting originally in speech and in vision, looking at some sort of lower level perceptual representations and tasks. But certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, looking at language, sort of discrete models with more semantics. And if you look at the latest GPT-2 models from OpenAI, I think they have like 8 billion words and something on the order of 1 billion parameters. Have you, in working in this space of modeling of text and other discrete variables, taken any insights from empirically or theoretically from just the tremendous data, compute, and really representational richness that we see in some of the current models? Has that shaped your thinking, or?
Yeah, it has. So maybe going back a little bit earlier than 3 or 4 years ago, one paper came out the same year as the LDA paper in JMLR is the word embeddings paper. The neural language modeling paper by Bengio and others.
Oh, Bengio, yeah.
And, I see the current trends and innovations in language as really building from that way of thinking about representing vocabularies as vectors. And something that we've been doing recently is thinking carefully about word embeddings. Now, the more
But
complicated
you can think of a
attention-based.
topic model as an embedding in some ways, or
You can. I think they're doing different things. So
Okay.
this is where I was trying to get to,
Yeah.
is that I think embeddings and topic models are doing different things.
Okay.
Topic models are capturing heterogeneity in the documents. They're capturing that I can write a document and it's about sports and health, or it's about
see.
business and sports, and that somehow these two threads of topics form put different statistical constraints on the words that I use. If it's about business, then I might use some business words, and if it's about sports, I might use some sports words, and then if I take a document and I make it about health and sports, then I'm going to use the same sports words and health words. Word embeddings are more focused. They're saying, the meaning of a word, if a word is going to occur with another word, then its representation needs to play nicely with that representation, no matter what it is. And mathematically, the difference is between a mixture model and an exponentiated dot product, which is where we got to when we started studying Bengio's paper. This was maybe 5-6 years ago. And something I'm interested in is combining these two ideas. I think there's something really powerful about taking a really high-dimensional space, like a vocabulary, and saying, look, I know that there's 200,000 words in this vocabulary, but really there's 100 semantic dimensions, and each word is somehow represented in those dimensions, and then I get things like closeness of words that are similar in meaning. I think that's a very powerful idea, and it's one that is orthogonal or complementary to the idea behind topic models, which says that there are heterogeneous topics expressed in documents. So that's an area that we're working on right now, is how to combine these two ideas. Another idea that I think
I really look forward to hearing that. That
Yeah.
seems like a really fundamental breakthrough in thinking about representation and things.
Yeah,
like that.
because topic models, if you expand the vocabulary, I don't know if you found this with LSA, but at some point we I used to trim the vocabulary when I fit a topic model for computational reasons.
I did too.
And I'm sure you did the same, right? You say, okay, I'm going to select the top, 5,000 words by TF-IDF. But then computation got better, and we could handle bigger vocabularies, and we tried to, and we would expand the vocabulary, say, in an LDA model, and the model wouldn't work. And so what I thought we were doing for computational reasons, I think we were also doing for statistical reasons, in that the long tail of the vocabulary, the very rare words, they can misdirect the learning algorithm towards decompositions into topics that don't make sense. And I think that combining embeddings and topics together could help solve that problem. The other idea I love in the recent wave of work on language and deep learning is attention. I think attention is a very powerful and interesting idea. And what we do in my group, we're not Microsoft, and we don't have a big cluster of computers and
We can talk about that
yeah,
a little later.
and huge huge data sets. But we like to glean. You asked me what we glean from these recent innovations. What we like to glean from them are mathematical ideas that could be used or made more formal or perhaps generalized. And so I think attention is one of those ideas that has a lot of potential, where the idea being that the features that I use to predict some kind of outcome, which ones are relevant could depend on the whole feature set as well. That's the way I think of attention. And I think that's a really beautiful, interesting idea that's not really looked at much in statistics and in machine learning, but via attention we could start thinking about that in more broad areas.
Yeah, that sounds really fun. I like the notion of trying to make some structure in some ways with these embeddings. You did some of your early work that I really like. Did some of this. You brought various kinds of structure to topic models.
Yeah.
You did some work on correlated topic models, on hierarchical topic models. And my favorite in that family of extensions of topic models was the one where you looked at dynamic topic models, bringing a notion of time.
Yeah.
Can you comment on sort of what, and I know you've done stuff that's related to that recently, again, looking at dynamic embeddings.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about time and how you thought about it in, let's say, 2006-ish, and how you think about it a decade later?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought up that work. I'm also continue to be excited
Didn't it just
about
win a Test of Time award?
Time series. It did. It won the
Awesome.
Test of Time award. I'm excited about the idea of time series of documents, especially the kind that we look at when we analyze scientific literature that change over hundreds of years.
Right.
And so, the story behind that work is that I was a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon with John Lafferty.
Oh, okay.
And I went to that postdoc partly so that I could drive to Michigan to see my wife, but also because John Lafferty is a very inspiring person. And when I met him, when I was interviewing for the postdoc, he said, what would be fun to work on? I made a deal with JSTOR. JSTOR is this online archive of academic papers. I made a deal with JSTOR, and they're going to hand me all the OCR from their journals. And their journals go back hundreds of years. And, we should play with this. What can we do with it? And so, we got the data, and we got, in particular, Science magazine for 100 years, from like 1880 to the year 2000, 120 years. And, the tacit assumption of LDA that the documents are basically exchangeable, that it doesn't matter which one came first and which one came last, that assumption flies out the window. Right? We all agree that topics, the way you describe neuroscience in 1900 is different from the way you describe neuroscience in 1990, but they are somehow the same topic. So it was motivated by that data set that we wanted to look at how documents change over time.
But many things could change over time, right? So one is really the semantics of the world, the topics or the embedded dimensions that you have, and another is the vocabulary and breakthroughs in each one of those. Which of those do you think was happening? Is it sort of the fundamentals of semantics that are changing, or is it the richness in different parts of that space?
Well, in the science case, I think it was the fields were changing, right?
Okay.
These, another side of this is that why do we want to use topic models? Often it's so that we can interpret what's going on in the data set, learn something about the data. And so if your idea is that the topics are representing real fields in the world, and you want to be able to connect, say, an article about neuroscience in 1880 to an article about neuroscience in 1990, then you have to address that they don't use the same vocabularies to talk about the same field. And so I think it is the vocabulary that's changing, but that's really kind of a proxy for the knowledge changing, right? Neuroscience grew.
What were some of the fun insights that you took either from that data set or more foundational insights about modeling techniques for data that's certainly not uniform over time? And
there's some fun things that we found. Well, one thing, it was a very distracting project because I mentioned that I felt a lot of passion in grad school just analyzing text data. It was fun. And this data set is incredibly fun, right? Because it's historical science articles. And, I remember finding one about ice cream where, an old article about a scientist who is figuring out whether or not ice cream is poisonous or something like that. Anyway, there's a lot of hilarious and a lot of days gone to reading archival science articles.
100-year-old science articles. You could have spent your time in worse ways.
Yeah,
probably.
that's true. But one result I remember from that work is that again, why we fit a topic model is because we want to somehow represent the fields that the document is talking about, and when documents span hundreds of years, those fields change, and you need to acknowledge that if you want to make the connections. So we built a way to find similar articles based on topics, right? You would do this with LSA too, right? You would use the per document representation that LSA provides for you to find other similar articles. Now, what's cool about topics over time, dynamic topics, is that when you do that, the topic 50 at year 1880 is different from the perspective of the vocabulary from topic 50 in 1980, but they are connected by smoothly changing words throughout those 100 years. And that lets us connect then a document that by TF-IDF would have nothing in common. Right? You writing about neuroscience in 1980 has nothing in common with me writing about neuroscience in 1880, but they are connected via the topics. So the result that I remember was that, in whatever year it was, 1920 I think it was, there was a kind of crude science article about somebody dissecting an orangutan brain, right? And so they basically, I think the article might have even been called "On the Brain of the Orang" or something like that.
Okay.
But that doesn't seem right. It rhymes. How would that be possible? But anyway, so in that article, they kind of take an orangutan, bonk it on its head, open up the brain, draw what they saw, send it to science. And if you look at the whole corpus, 100,000 articles or 150,000 articles, the article closest to that was from 1980, which was basically a modern version of the same thing, but with all this kind of fancy imaging and other neuroscience methods. So it struck me because these are two articles that, again, from the TF-IDF perspective, from term frequencies, are completely independent of each other, or more or less.
Yeah.
But they really, the dynamic topic model captured this, I think of it as a subtle connection, that the same field changed over 100 years, but within that field, these two articles are describing the same kinds of things. There was a technical aspect to that work too, which was that was the first time we really started analyzing document sizes of the order of hundreds of thousands. And with the time series, it was particularly complicated because the time series destroyed a lot of the nice computational aspects of LDA, the simple LDA paper from 2003. So in the context of that paper, that was the first time I really dealt with not what I call non-conjugate models, that don't enjoy the same mathematical properties that LDA enjoys. And the 150,000 articles was another challenge. Yeah, so I see that work as kind of bringing my research into its next phase, which was around non-conjugate models and larger data sets.
Right, but time is a particularly interesting
and time too.
dimension.
Yeah,
so can you talk a little bit, maybe at an intuitive level, about how you evolve the topic model over time, or how you?
Sure. So there were a few works about topics over time, and the first one, the one with John in 2006, that one basically said, look, there are, say, 100 topics, and each one, instead of just being a distribution over words, which is what topics are usually, is now a sequence of distributions over words. And moreover, there's a smoothness to it, so that the probability of the word brain in 1880 is going to be close to the probability of the word brain in 1881. It's going to be close to the probability of the word brain in 1882, and so on. And that's it. So we assume that they smoothly change over time, and then you condition on the documents, and you learn these topics that go from, kind of crude way of talking about the brain in 1880 to a more refined way of talking about the brain in 1980.
Did you ever run it backwards?
Never ran it backwards. It's a great idea. I mean, it did also do some funny things.
Because in some ways, it's our perspective on the world, right? We live in a world where the topics that are discussed, the things we take for granted, shape how we interpret older work. It might actually be fun to do that.
It would be fun to run it backwards. So like one funny thing that happened with that model I remember too is the word laser. Lasers were invented in 1960. But I mentioned that the probability has to change smoothly. And so in 1960 people started talking about lasers, but because the model required that the word probabilities change smoothly, what it did to account for how much people talked about lasers in 1960 is that it gave laser higher and higher probability even before it was invented. So, we called that the laser problem. We didn't solve it.
Seems like looking into the future.
So, the kind of the public relations way of saying it is, oh, look at this model, it's so intelligent, it's predicting the existence of lasers. But really what's happening is that the linear dynamic system that we imposed on the model, and it was another lesson for us around kind of, modeling assumptions and data together interact. And when we're building models, deep learning models too, we need to think about that, right? How much of what we're getting out of the model is coming out of the assumptions we're making, and how much of it is coming out
even
of
the objective functions, the ways we
and the
optimize those
objective
and all that
functions
stuff.
too.
Yep. So this has been really fun to hear about the evolution of your thinking about topic models, representation of text, and now thinking about interesting ways to combine that with some of the embedding work. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your work in causal inference.
Sure.
And what you're going to talk about later today, I guess, is some of that thinking about how to deal with causal reasoning in the case where we don't have, from observational data, in the case
Yeah.
where we don't have a carefully controlled experiment. And as I understand it, your work tries to reduce some of the pretty stringent assumptions that had been present in earlier models about the need to observe all the confounding variables. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you got interested in the topic and how you're moving forward in that space?
Sure. About 5 years ago, I moved from Princeton to Columbia.
Right.
And I don't know if it was a causal effect, but when I got to Columbia, I became interested in causal inference.
Okay.
I had been interested in it before and
Right.
reading about it and trying to learn about it. And then when I got to Columbia, I don't know, it was a change. So I thought, okay,
Yep.
And so I sat down with my lab and we started reading everything we could find about causal inference. And there's many really good books out there about causal inference. There's lots of different perspectives on causal inference. So there's a good book by Imbens and Rubin.
Yep.
It's a good book by Pearl. It's a good
Yep.
book by Hernon and Robbins. There's lots of work on causal inference. And my motivation was, that for years we've been working on finding structure in large data sets and analyzing large data
Yeah.
sets with machine learning. And it's all for explanation and observation.
That's right.
When we look at topics, they seem like they are real things, right? This was part of our history, my lab's history. But we all knew that, that they were artifacts of this data set that happened to fall in our lap. So how can we, the question I wanted to ask was, how can we use these tools, these machine learning tools that we, the community, have spent decades developing to really say something about how the world works?
Okay.
And it feels silly, the causal inference theory is quite conservative, but it felt silly, it felt unintuitive to say, I can observe, millions and millions and millions of electronic health records,
Right.
but without a controlled trial, I can't tell you that Advil will help your headache. Right? This was kind of my motivation, and it's a cartoon.
Okay,
Of course,
yeah.
causal inference from observational data has been around a long time.
Sure.
But this was my
I see.
motivation. Like, I want to be able to do what we do with millions of data points, but do it in the service of really understanding something about the world. Okay, so that's how we got into it, and we started reading all kinds of books about it. And then I taught a couple of classes about it. There's kind of no better way to learn something
right.
than to sign up to teach a class about it. And it was through those classes that we started reading about some stuff in the genetics literature that seemed to point towards a way to find unobserved confounders with latent variable models like LDA.
I see.
And so, it wasn't said explicitly, but it was hinted at in the literature. And then with one of my great student, Yixin Wang, she and I formalized what that meant.
Okay.
And I think it's an interesting result. I'll talk about it this afternoon. The punchline of it, for to the degree that this conversation's about like my research over the course of the years, is that all these models that we were building, these topic models and other latent variable models that we were building over the years, the whole Bayesian machine learning community, they all come into play in this work to help find unobserved confounding. So it was kind of nice because it gave us a purpose for doing all this unsupervised learning and pattern finding.
So can you give a hint about how that works? Are you identifying structure, maybe collinearity or something amongst
absolutely.
variables,
Sure.
or is that sort of the...
Let me give more details. So, so the idea is, we call it multiple causal inference, first of all. And the idea is that, in a typical causal inference problem, you might want to know, does Advil help a headache?
Right.
In a multiple causal inference problem, you have many possible causes and an outcome. And you want to know, what is the causal effect of each of these causes?
Right.
Now, the example we use in our paper is actors and movie revenue. That's the example I use in my talk too. So I have, a data set of who was in what movie
Right.
and how much money the movie made, and I want to know how valuable each actor is. Now, the problem with all causal inference is confounding. What confounding means
Right.
is that there might be variables lurking in the background that affect who I put in the movie, or whether or not I take Advil, and affect the outcome.
Right.
How much money the movie makes, or whether the Advil
Yeah.
helps. So in the case of Advil, I know that Advil helps me, so I take Advil, and then it helps my headache. Now, that confounds an
Right.
estimate of how good Advil is, because if I just count up the number of people for whom Advil helps,
Right.
I'm going to get an overestimate of its efficacy. For the movie example, the example I like to give is James Bond movies, right? If
Okay.
I'm going to make a James Bond movie, that tells me who I'm going to cast, and it also tells me that the movie's going to make a lot of money. I'm going to cast James Bond, and I'm going to cast the other people that recur in James Bond movies, and the James Bond movie's going to make a lot of money. So the idea behind the paper is this. When you have multiple causes, like you have many actors, there's correlation. The hidden confounders, like James Bondness,
Right.
they induce correlation among who's in the movie, right? So
right.
Sean
Yeah,
Connery and Miss Moneypenny and M and Q, they're all correlated in terms
Yeah.
of appearing in the movie. And you can imagine a mixture model or a factor model,
Right.
an LSA model, these can capture this
Right.
correlation. And the theory says, the paper, the theoretical part of that paper, the paper provides an algorithm but also a theory.
Right.
The theory says that that variable, that hidden variable that you infer using
Right.
the methods of probabilistic machine learning, that captures a certain class of unobserved confounders.
I
And
see.
so you can analyze the data just of who's in what movie, and then use the hidden variable that you infer in that analysis to correct for some of the confounding without having to go and measure the confounding explicitly. So it is,
I see.
so the idea, to build on what you said, is that the
Yeah.
collinearity, the dependence structure between the causes is indirect evidence for hidden confounding. And we can use machine learning to extract that information without having to explicitly understand what it is.
Love to look forward to hearing
Yeah.
more about it.
It's a little hard
this
without a
afternoon.
blackboard and slides.
Well, we
Oh,
we
yeah.
don't have a blackboard. We have a nice wall behind us that we
Yeah.
shouldn't mess up with
Yeah.
my pen or chalk. Let me ask you one last question. First of all, it's been really fun listening to the many different people and perspectives that have influenced your research. I, for example, didn't know about the Andrew Ng's influence, or John Lafferty's,
Yeah.
and now more recently when you moved to Columbia, just a different set of people, a different
Yeah.
set of problems. And you historically have always been able to smoothly go in and out of different communities. So some of your early work was in SIG-IR,
Yep.
some in NeurIPS and ICML. You also have done work that has more of a cognitive science flavor, so working with,
Yep, with
Tom Griffiths and,
yeah.
and Josh Tenenbaum. And I'd love that breadth of perspectives. Do you have a sense of how you pull this off and what you get from each of those different disciplines?
Well, thanks for saying that I pull it off. I appreciate that.
Well, it's hard to influence many different fields, right?
Yeah.
And you seem to, have an ability to take ideas from one and bring them to another, and it's been a real formula for success, I
Yeah.
think, in your work and others.
Well,
Yeah.
the way I like to work is, I'm interested in lots of things, so I meet people from different areas and become interested in what they work on. Recently, I've been working with Susan Athey on
Right.
econometric methods, for example. And on one hand, and on the other hand, or not on the other hand, and simultaneously, I'm interested in developing new machine learning methods and new ways to extract value from data, right? To think about
Yeah.
machine learning that way. And I don't want to build machine learning methods in a vacuum, right? We could, if you think about what we
Yeah.
could do with machine learning, well,
Right.
we could do anything, but you want to do something that's useful to somebody. And so, for me, the way that and that's one reason to reach out to other communities to find out what kinds of problems they are
I see.
working on. And the other reason is that, to understand the limitations of machine learning, we need to use it to try to solve new kinds of problems, right? That's going to stress test
Yeah.
the algorithms. And so, that's where my motivation comes from. So like right now, for example, like I said, I've been working with Susan Athey, an econometrician, a great one. And I've also started working with some astrophysicists and some people that work on the microbiome who have fascinating problems. They're different from the kinds of problems that we have solved traditionally in machine learning, and they're stretching what we need to be able to do.
Right.
I think that, frankly, I think the story of probabilistic machine learning, Bayesian machine learning, and how approximate inference, back when we were doing LDA, we had to have certain conjugate forms of all of relationships between the hidden variables and the observations to be able to, even though the whole thing wasn't conjugate, we had to have conjugacy within each pair to be able to do variational inference. Through working with real scientists, that motivated getting out of that.
I see. Yeah.
Removing that limitation and moving to non-conjugate models and work on like probabilistic programming and black box variational inference. That stemmed from this need for working with non-conjugate models. And non-conjugate models also is where deep learning comes in. Deep generative models are non-conjugate models. But anyway, so thanks for saying I pull it off.
No, but with in an amazing way. And what's interesting is, I guess you hinted at it in your answer, it's not just talking to people with different technical backgrounds, with
that's right,
with statistics and computer science and maybe cognitive science, but really blending theory and practice. And so it sounds in your own work that you get hooked on a problem, and then given the broad perspectives you bring, try to figure out how to make that work.
And it's tricky. One aspect of it is you do want to make sure that you're working on a problem that is going to push machine learning in a new direction. Right. So sometimes I talk with scientists, and the answer is the HMM.
Right.
And then
but they don't want to hear that. They want deep reinforcement.
Well, no, they want to hear HMM.
Okay.
Yeah, no, they're happy. They're happy to learn about the HMM if it solves their problem. But then what they want is, they say, okay, great, so can you fit the HMM? And I say, well, we can, but it's not really, that's not really, though that's really changed. So one thing I've also noticed is that in my class on probabilistic machine learning, I used to get computer science students and statistics students. And now I get students from every department, and they're, they are students of many fields are now becoming versed and technical in programming and in doing machine learning, which is great for our field.
And do you see that in the Data Science Institute? And part of the reason for that, I guess, was that it did bring different application areas, different problem areas together with the hopes of creating the same theoretical foundations and underpinnings.
Yeah,
to
I use
work across many of those.
sorry, I didn't mean to. I use applied machine learning and data science interchangeably, although maybe I should be more nuanced.
Great. So let me just ask one final question. And that is, what advice do you have for students who are interested in getting into applied machine learning, data science, and computer science more generally? What sort of backgrounds and perspectives do you look for example, in students that you take into your lab?
That's a good question. Those are two questions.
Okay.
So
answer whichever one or both.
I'll answer both. Okay. So the background that I look for in students and postdocs in my group, I'm looking for students who will be interested in this kind of model that I just described. Right. We're going to reach out across disciplines. We're going to look for somebody who has an applied problem that we're interested in and try to make progress on a real problem with a real data set. And that might involve theoretical work and applied work.
Right.
I'm looking for students then who are comfortable programming and working on real world problems, and also students who are comfortable with mathematics and statistics. To be clear, I'm also looking for students who are willing to find something that they're interested in. So, and this goes along with my advice for somebody who wants to get interested in, who wants to get into applied machine learning research. I think it's important, and it's what got me excited back in Berkeley, to be doing something you're interested in. And to be clear with my students, I don't even need to be that interested in what they're working on. I should be interested in the technical aspects of it, the machine learning aspects of it. But the domain, I want it to be a domain that gets you out of bed in the morning, like text was for me when I was in graduate school. And because I think that that's really important. Graduate school is is can be difficult from the motivation perspective sometimes. And you need to, having something that keeps you excited is really important to getting through the ups and downs of graduate school, which is ultimately really worthwhile, but can be difficult. So, my advice is to find something you like, not to worry about trends and fads in the field, because you'll do your best work if you're working on something that you like to work on, both from the technical perspective, the methodological perspective, and from which application you choose.
Have you seen any trends over the 15 years in which you've been a professor, and the kinds of things that attract students to thinking about applications of machine learning or AI? I think there's a lot of work I've seen in the last few years about AI for social good, responsible.
Yeah.
So do you see some of that trend, or is it really vary by person rather than by time?
I think it varies by person, although I have noticed that, I don't know if it's a trend or if it's just my group right now, there's a lot of interest in the social aspects of machine learning, and also in the computational social sciences, which I think is a great, also a great area for like quantitative political science and sociology. These are great areas for machine learning where we can have a big impact and where it's not yet as widely used.
Okay. Great. David, thank you so much for, first of all, visiting Microsoft, spending the time to do this, really maybe a little bit about what drives David to the amazing influence that he's had in the community. I've learned a lot, actually, about some of the inspiration for your work and the guiding principles that you use to drive your own interest in the field. So thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, thanks. I enjoyed it. It's always nice to see you.
Thanks.